Wondering.
It's late afternoon on March 28, 1979. Gary Miller hurries up a marble staircase underneath a gold rotunda. He climbs higher up the stairs and gazes across the lobby of Pennsylvania's State Capitol building. Today, the Capitol is swarming with reporters. Their voices echo off the walls, and Miller can hear them gossiping about one subject and one subject alone: the incident at 3 Mile Island. Miller shakes his head. He's the supervisor of the nearby nuclear power plant, and he knows he needs to keep a straight face with so many journalists nearby. But inside, he's fuming. He shouldn't even be here right now. He's been dealing with high radiation levels in a nuclear core that may have been damaged. Miller needs to be back at his post managing the crisis, not here. But he wasn't allowed to stay at the plant. Not after he received orders from his boss, Jack Herbine, who demanded that Miller attend a meeting with the lieutenant governor to explain what exactly is happening at 3 Mile Island. Miller walks through a hallway and follows Herbine into Bill Scranton's office. The room is packed with attorneys and scientific experts, all standing with grim expressions. And in the middle of this circle sits Scranton. Miller feels shaky when he sees the lieutenant governor, surrounded by some of the most powerful people in the state. Yet right now, Miller's goal is simple. He needs to quickly update Scranton about the incident and then get back to the plant and stop the growing crisis. Miller shuts a heavy wooden door and turns back to Scranton. The other men in the room go quiet and part to the sides of the room as Scranton approaches Miller and Herbine with a look of fury. So I've learned that you've been airing out the plant. I've got press asking me if you all are just fanning out radiation across Pennsylvania. You want to explain yourselves? Maybe explain why you haven't told anyone about it? Miller feels every eye focused on him. His hands begin to shake, but he knows he needs to keep a steady mind. Sir, it's normal for a nuclear power plant to vent steam. That's all it is, just steam. That's how we stabilize the heat. It's like opening up a tea kettle that's whistling. Well, that's a very cute comparison, a tea kettle, huh? So you're telling me that radiation escaping off-site is normal? I guess we got different definitions of the term. Sir, the radiation leak this morning came from the auxiliary building. The steam we've been venting has nothing to do with that, I promise. Scranton pauses, looking away as he runs a hand through his hair. Let's say I believe your promises, but that doesn't change what the public thinks. Anything visible coming out of your plant right now is going to frighten people. All they're going to see is big steamy clouds of radiation. But radiation doesn't look like steam, sir. It's invisible. Damn it, you know what else is invisible? Panic. And both have serious consequences. Right then, Jack Herbine stands and addresses the lieutenant governor. Gentlemen, I know tempers are high, but it's important that everyone understands something. The incident at the plant today is not significant. There's nothing to worry about. Miller is stunned. They're dealing with high radiation levels and rising temperatures. He can't believe his boss would make such a rosy claim, and it seems that the reassurances aren't working on Scranton either. Scranton stares at Herbine, his mouth hanging open. Mr. Herbine, was radiation leaked off-site or not? Well, yes it was, but the off-site release was minimal. And did you inform the press that radiation had left the plant, or not? No, I didn't. They didn't ask me. Miller feels the atmosphere in the room go cold. He clears his throat to speak, but Scranton beats him to it. Listen, everyone. 3 Mile Island is not going to release anything into the atmosphere or the river or anywhere else without informing the state in advance. And I mean nothing. Am I clear, Mr. Herbine? Mr. Miller? Good day. And with that, Scranton walks out of the room, a scowl plastered on his face. Jack Herbine sighs in relief and waves for Miller to follow him out the door. But Gary Miller remains stunned, frozen in place. He had his chance to explain the situation to the lieutenant governor to get Bill Scranton on their side, but somehow the conversation fell apart before he was even underway. Now Miller thinks they burned a crucial bridge to the governor's office and lost an important ally if this grows into a full-fledged crisis. But for Gary Miller, that's not the worst part. They need to keep venting steam from the power plant. But now with the lieutenant governor's order, they may have to stop. And without literally letting off steam at 3 Mile Island, temperatures could rise, and the crisis could grow far, far worse. American Scandal is sponsored by the new Audible original Bad Republican by Meghan McCain. In her debut audio memoir, Meghan McCain gives a first-hand look into the life of the conservative rebel and departing co-host of The View. You'll hear what it's like to grow up as the daughter of an American icon and to mourn his loss very publicly just 1 year into her tenure as co-host of America's most-watched daytime talk show. Her memoir also reveals how she handled attacks from the U.S. president and her thoughts on cancel culture, dating, and how our country treats new mothers. It's unsparingly honest, deeply relatable, and highly entertaining. Go beyond what you know about Meghan McCain from TV and your newsfeed. Visit audible.com/Bad Republican and listen now.
We get support from the new podcast, Hemingway's Picasso. Stephen Coe lived many lives. He was an NFL journeyman, a male model, and one of the most well-connected smugglers in 1980s Miami. Coe collected many souvenirs from his adventures, but his most treasured bounty, a beautiful ceramic crafted by Pablo Picasso and gifted to Ernest Hemingway at the author's Cuban home. So the story goes. Lost during the Cuban Revolution, the artwork resurfaced when Coe took it as payment for a drug run financed by the notorious Pablo Escobar. Coe passed away in 2018, passing the piece down to his son, Stevie. Stevie feels he needs to complete his father's mission of selling this piece and telling Steve's cinematic life story. Is the Picasso authentic or a fraud? Was Steve Coe a big talker or a real deal smuggler? Listen to new episodes of Hemingway's Picasso every Monday wherever you get your podcasts.
From Wondery, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Scandal. On March 28, 1979, engineers at Pennsylvania's 3 Mile Island power plant lost control of their nuclear reactor. Safety mechanisms broke down, and instruments contradicted each other, leaving the plant's operators in a state of panic and confusion. What none of the operators realized was that a critical relief valve had gotten stuck open. It was a valve that was known to have defects, and which started blasting out radioactive water and steam. By the time the valve was finally shut, the damage was done. 3 Mile Island lost 32,000 gallons of coolant, a liquid necessary to prevent the reactor's core from overheating and melting down. Soon, the confusion and panic would spread far beyond the nuclear power plant. The public learned that radiation had leaked from the plant and found its way into surrounding communities. This plunged the state government into crisis as the governor's staff began planning for possible evacuations. This is episode 2, The Ticking Clock. It's 5:20 p.m. on Wednesday, March 28th. Gary Miller walks quickly out of the 3 Mile Island guardhouse. Miller, the plant supervisor, is wearing head-to-toe anti-contamination gear. As he walks, he listens to the rasp of his breath through the regulator to his oxygen tank. This has been a day like no other, and it just keeps going. Miller worried that he'd lose precious time during his trip to Harrisburg, to the state capital. His worst fears were proven right. Now, hours later, he's finally heading back to the plant, and it's still in crisis. Miller navigates a maze of fluorescent passageways, which lead to the control room of Unit 2. He thinks about the priorities in front of him. First and foremost, he's got to get the temperature under control. Soon, Miller reaches the heavy, reinforced door. He buzzes himself in. Right away, he's engulfed by blaring alarms and flashing lights. He can feel his pulse quickening and his breath getting short. The situation appears no more under control than it was hours ago. The one bright note is that the operators are no longer wearing their protective breathing gear. The foreman greets Miller and tells him that the radioactivity in the room has dropped to the point where they can breathe normally without respirators. But, the foreman adds, that's the only silver lining, because the temperature in the reactor is still high. Miller takes off his mask and regulator and shouts out a curse. Now they're stuck. Scranton ordered them not to vent any steam, but that's the only way to cool the reactor. Miller thinks over the options, and he realizes he has only one. He just has to convince Scranton to change his mind. Miller heads toward the phone to call Jack Herbine to run the strategy by him. But as he crosses the room, the phone is already ringing. He picks it up. Control room, Unit 2, this is Miller.
Gary, it's Jack Herbine.
Jack, I was just about to call you. Listen, the heat is still up and it's rising. We need to talk to Scranton. We gotta change course. We gotta vent this thing. There's silence on the other end of the line. So Miller presses on. I know it's not ideal, but there's no other way.
No, Gary, we're not going to do that.
Jack, sorry, I know that folks don't want to see steam, but it's just steam. We have to make that point clear.
Gary, listen, it's too late for that.
No, it's not too late, I swear. We need to call up Scranton's office and explain what we need to do.
We're not going to do that. Top brass is saying we need to do it a different way. They want to get a pump restarted. The idea is we'll get the coolant around faster.
Miller shuts his eyes, shakes his head. He can't believe he's hearing this plan. Jack, the temperature is still way too high. That's why we turned the pumps off. They were shaking like crazy trying to deal with all the steam.
Yeah, well, that brings us to the second part of the plan. You get rid of the steam by filling the reactor to the gills with coolant. Then you can restart your pump.
You're kidding. No, that's too dangerous.
Babcock and Wilcox think it's a good idea, so that's what we're going to do.
Babcock and Wilcox are the ones who designed the plant. The ones who designed the faulty valve that probably got us into this whole mess. I can't say I put a lot of stock in their word, Jack. Look, we've already uncovered the core once. If we make the wrong move, the thing's just going to fly out of control.
Gary, listen to me, and listen carefully. This will work. I want you to commence emergency coolant injection, and I want you to do it now.
Miller wants to take the phone receiver and slam it into the wall. He wants to tell Herbine that this is going to lead to a disaster, but instead he just remains silent.
Gary, that was an order. I'm ordering you to commence injection immediately.
Miller slowly exhales. It's then he realizes there's no way out of this. Roger that. Order acknowledged. Commencing emergency coolant injection. Miller takes one more breath and calls for the operation to begin. He then joins the other operators, and the group waits, their hands clutched to their faces as the coolant shoots into the core. A moment later, there's a slight tremor. Miller freezes. This could be it. The core could be damaged beyond repair and headed toward a meltdown. Miller grows dizzy with the thought. He wipes his forehead and steadies himself on a nearby desk. This is a perfect storm. Mistakes and cover-ups from the company that designed the reactor. Cowardice from political leaders. Even more cowardice from the people who own this plant. Miller still can't wrap his mind around everything that's gone wrong. 3 Mile Island was supposed to be foolproof. Instead, it could be ground zero of the world's biggest man-made disaster. But then Miller hears a noise and looks up. The pump has started to operate. Miller scans the gauges, looking for any spike or drop in pressure, but there's none. The pump keeps going. The plan is working. Already the operators say that the reactor temperature is dropping. Miller lets out his breath, and he realizes he's been holding it for what feels like minutes. His prediction was wrong. He'd been so certain. It's a moment of sweet relief. But it doesn't last long, because Gary Miller knows that even though they're succeeding here and now, there are countless surprises ahead, and plenty that can still go terribly wrong. It's now 10 p.m. in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Mike Pintek hurries past the rounded arches and Greek columns inside the state capitol building. Soon he approaches the press room and finds it filled to the brim with reporters. Pintek gazes across the room stunned. Pintek is the news director of the local radio station WKBO. He's often on the scene with other reporters, but he's never been to an event that feels so charged, so full of buzzing electric energy. Pintek spots reporters from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. He also sees journalists from Washington and New York. These journalists cover the biggest stories in the country, and now they're here, reporting on the developments at 3 Mile Island. All at once, the magnitude of this unfolding crisis hits Pintek and nearly takes his breath away. A moment later, a few of these reporters approach Pintek. They ask for his take on all the rumors about 3 Mile Island. Pintek grins as he begins filling in the details for these hard-hitting journalists. He recounts how the lieutenant governor first said that the incident was contained, but how radiation was then found off-site from the power plant. Pintek and the reporters continue gossiping until the room settles down and goes quiet. The press conference is about to begin, so Pintek grabs a seat and takes out a notepad. A moment later, Bill Scranton steps to the dais. The lieutenant governor looks weary and stooped and pauses before plunging in. Scranton then tells reporters that he has finally received an official update from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the federal agency that oversees nuclear power plants. The 3 Mile Island plant is now under control. All readings are stable. Pintek squints as he listens. Reporters are busy scribbling in their notebooks, taking down Scranton's words. Something doesn't feel right to Mike Pintek. There was already a radiation leak, and the plant had declared a general emergency. Not to mention, Met Ed had already been accused of deceiving the public. But now at the end of the day, they're all being told the crisis is over? Pintek sets down his pen. He can feel it, like adrenaline rushing through his body. This isn't the whole story, far from it. And at that moment, Pintek makes the decision. No matter what it takes, he's going to dig, and he's going to search, and keep making calls until he uncovers the full truth. It's Thursday, March 29th, and just a day after the events began unfolding at 3 Mile Island. In downtown Harrisburg, morning sunlight shines through the windows of a small hotel room. The light lands on a tape recorder, which lies on a round wooden table. On one side of the table is Mike Pintek. On the other side is a middle-aged man in a coat and tie. The man is named Dr. Ernest Sternglass, and he's a nuclear engineer and a respected physicist from the University of Pittsburgh. Sternglass speaks with a faint German accent as he explains that he uncovered a number of surprises near 3 Mile Island. Pintek licks his lips as he begins jotting down notes. This is exactly the kind of scoop he's been looking for. He can't get himself to accept the official statements about 3 Mile Island. So last night after the press conference, he got on the phone with anti-nuclear activists. They told him that Dr. Sternglass had driven down from Pittsburgh and that the researcher had surveyed the area around 3 Mile Island. And apparently, he's happy to talk. That's why right now in this hotel room, Sternglass begins explaining what he uncovered this morning. He says that he drove down to 3 Mile Island armed with his own Geiger counter, and he walked through the fields across the river from the power plant. The counter clicked and whined, and that could only mean one thing. The radiation levels were much higher outside 3 Mile Island than officials indicated. Sternglass adds that radiation is probably still leaking from the plant. As Pintek takes down notes, the physicist adjusts his thick glasses and pauses. And then, in a low, serious voice, Sternglass explains that local residents could face devastating consequences if they're not evacuated. There's a significant risk that women will have miscarriages and stillbirths, that children will suffer from leukemia. As Sternglass continues to describe the dangers, Pintek glances at the television in the corner. Good Morning America plays quietly, and on the show is an executive from Metropolitan Edison, the parent company of 3 Mile Island. The executive smiles in what seems to be an attempt to put the nation at ease. Pintek shakes his head. He can't stomach this terrible disconnect between what he's hearing and what the rest of the country is being told. Pintek then asks a few more questions, turns off his recorder, and thanks Dr. Sternglass for his time. And as Pintek rises, a sinking feeling sets in on him. He knows he has a big decision to make. Minutes later, Mike Pintek exits the hotel. He steps into the parking lot and makes his way to his yellow Camaro. He steps in and drops the tape recorder on the passenger seat. He jams the keys into the ignition and is about to turn the car on, but then stops. He looks again at the tape recorder. Feels like a loaded gun, ready to fire. Pintek stares out the windshield, watching pedestrians strolling down the sidewalk. Suddenly, Pintek feels a stab of anxiety. Bill Scranton, the state's lieutenant governor, said that 3 Mile Island was safe, and this came from the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission itself. They said that any radiation was well contained. Pintek balls up his fists. He's 27 years old. Who is he to tell thousands of residents that they should flee their homes? Based on what? One lone anti-nuclear scientist? Pintek wants to broadcast this interview. But if he does, and Sternglass is wrong, he'll look like a fool for sounding a false alarm. And more importantly, residents will likely panic. Pintek knows he has two options. Drive to the WKBO station and air the interview, or go home, fix himself some breakfast, and pretend that he and Dr. Sternglass never met. But right then, Pintek sees a man in faded jeans, walking hand in hand with a little girl. Pintek imagines he's a young father, walking his daughter to school. And that does it. Sternglass could certainly be wrong, Pintek thinks. But the residents who live around here are Pintek's people. They deserve to hear both sides of the story. Pintek knows they have a right to protect their health and their families. Pintek looks once more at the little girl. Then he starts up the car and pulls out quickly. He U-turns, his tires screeching, and races south to the WKBO station. It's time to sound the alarm. In the small town of Fox Lake, Illinois, Joe Glennowitz was a hometown hero and 30-year veteran of the local police department. On September 1st, 2015, just 1 month from retirement, he was found dead outside an abandoned cement plant, shot in the chest twice at close range. While the town and Joe's family mourned his passing, hundreds of police officers launched a manhunt to find his killer. After weeks of searching, the lead investigator discovered chilling secrets about Joe, the local police department, and the village of Fox Lake. These were secrets that, once uncovered, would put the town in the national spotlight and haunt them for years to come. Wondery's shocking true crime podcast, Over My Dead Body, is back for a 3rd season with a story about corruption, betrayal, and the secrets of a fallen hero. Follow Over My Dead Body Season 3, Fox Lake, on Apple Podcasts, or you can listen early and ad-free by subscribing to Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts or the Wondery app.
This year marks the 20th anniversary of the attacks of September 11th, but I don't want to talk about that day. I want to talk about the next day, and every day after that. I'm Dan Taberski. I'm the host of the podcast 912. Here's stories about how 9/11 the day became 9/11 the idea. 912 is available now on Amazon Music.
It's 12:30 p.m. on Thursday, March 29th, 1979. Bill Scranton is sweating, his chest tight, as he squirms into a wetsuit. He then steps into a set of coveralls, which are fitted and taped to his boots. He pulls on 4 layers of gloves, and then 2 men surround him as they finish checking and rechecking the seals on his head-to-toe white protective gear. Right now, Scranton, the lieutenant governor, is in 3 Mile Island's Unit 2 ready room. He's suiting up for a tour unlike any he's ever taken in his political career. Scranton is about to walk through a nuclear power plant as its operators struggle to contain a crisis. As he finishes suiting up, Scranton stares across the room, his mind whirling. Just this morning, Mike Pintek from WKBO aired a sensational interview about 3 Mile Island. Pintek spoke with a physicist named Dr. Sternglass, and the researcher issued dire warnings about the threats to the public's health. Right away, the calls started to pour in. Hundreds of concerned residents called the State House and asked if they were truly in danger. They were desperate to know whether they should evacuate. Scranton's office reassured them that they were safe, but many were inconsolable. That's what did it for Scranton. He decided then to drive down from Harrisburg and tour the nuclear power plant himself. He wanted to observe the plant firsthand to make his own assessment. That way he can report back to the governor and his constituents, and he'll be able to tell who's got the right information and who may be lying. In the Unit 2 ready room, Scranton pulls on his face mask. He adjusts his breathing regulator, and right away, the sound of his own breathing drowns out everything else. The operators give him a thumbs up. Scranton returns the gesture with as much confidence as he can muster and steps out into the central yard. As he walks through the yard, he feels like he's wandered into an alien landscape. Huge, windowless box structures surround concrete bunkers. 4 cooling towers dominate the skyline. A group of technicians lead the way, and Scranton follows. Soon they reach the auxiliary building and head down a set of stairs. They pass underneath metal bridges and cross over dizzying rows of tubing. The technicians explain how the pumps are now circulating coolant and bringing down the reactor's temperature so it can shut off. Scranton listens while surveying the massive pumps and the metal machinery looming in the shadows. Scranton has never given much consideration to these nuclear plants. He's always supported any electricity produced in Pennsylvania. That used to be coal, but more and more, nuclear power is turning into the way of the future. At first, it seemed like a good way to power the grid and bring jobs to his state. But now, as a warm bead of sweat drips down his forehead, Scranton wonders if this was a terrible mistake, a Pandora's box that should never have been opened. Scranton and the technicians soon reach the bottom floor, and it's then that Scranton spots a puddle of liquid on the ground. He freezes. He wonders whether it could be radioactive. Maybe there's a leak somewhere. Maybe it got on his suit and seeped in. His breath quickens, and immediately Scranton thinks this was a bad idea. He's coming here, nuclear energy, all of it. But then a group of workers enter the basement. They start mopping up the water, talking casually to each other. Scranton tilts his head and stares. They don't seem fazed in the least. So slowly, Scranton feels his fear fading away. No one around him is acting worried, he realizes, so why should he? He's probably just prey to his own irrational fears, he thinks. And the more he looks at the machinery, the more he realizes that it's just that, a machine. And all machines are fixable. As he makes his way back up the stairs, Scranton thinks ahead, planning what he'll say at today's press conference. He'll report these on-site findings, and he'll be the leader to restore calm to a shaken public. A few hours later, a man takes a deep breath and steps into full-body protective gear. His name is Pete Velez, and he's the foreman who oversees radiation protection. Velez turns and looks over at his partner, a man named Ed Hauser, the chemistry foreman for 3 Mile Island. Together, the 2 men are suiting up for what promises to be a dangerous and nerve-wracking expedition. All the higher-ups wanted to know how badly the reactor core had been damaged, but there was only one way to get a true assessment. Someone needs to head into the reactor building and take a sample from the coolant. It's a dangerous job, one that likely means exposure to high levels of radiation. For Pete Velez, there's only one way to do this, on his own. Velez is a former Navy man, and so when he was asked to select a teammate for the mission, he chose himself. He didn't want to risk anyone else's life. But he soon learned it wasn't that easy. This is a 2-man job, and Velez isn't a chemist, so Hauser offered to join the dangerous mission. After suiting up, the 2 men make their way down a set of stairs into the reactor building. As they descend, Velez feels a chill in his spine. This area was abandoned in the early hours after the accident. It feels haunted. In one room, it's as though people simply vanished. There are hats and coats sitting on racks, phones off the hook, pot of coffee still 3/4 full. Velez instinctively tries to wipe his brow, forgetting that he's wearing full-body protective gear. He laughs and smiles at Hauser, and then he presses forward into the building. Soon the men reach the area just outside the reactor. A large metal wall rises before them, with a door that looks like a bank vault. Velez sets his equipment down and turns to Hauser. All right, Ed, we need to coordinate. You line up the valves on the pipe. I'll go in and get the sample. That'll keep us safe. It'll cut down our exposure. I'll time you. All right, roger that. Velez heads to the door of the reactor and unlocks it by turning a big metal wheel. He checks his watch and nods to Hauser. All right, ready in 3, 2, 1. Now, go. Hauser dashes in and heads straight for the back panel. Velez watches through a window as Hauser turns about a dozen valves. Hauser checks the gauge and makes sure that the coolant bill sample has started moving. Then he bolts back through the door and shuts it. Hot damn, all right, we got coolant flowing. Nice work, nice. That was just 32 seconds. Hauser nods, and Velez gives him a relieved grin. The first step is done. Now they have to wait for enough coolant to run through the system before taking their sample. Velez impatiently drums his fingers. He's well aware that with the valves open, radiation levels are now building inside the room. Finally, it's Velez's turn. But before he takes the sample, he dashes in with his Geiger counter and touches the tip of the probe to the sample line. The needle in the Geiger slams to the side. Velez then races back out and slams the door. He turns to Hauser, his eyes wide. It's over 1,000 rads on contact, you got. Without our gear, we'd be dead in 30 minutes. You still want to do this? I want has nothing to do with it. You good to track my time? Hauser nods. Then Velez throws open the door and rushes inside. He holds a glass beaker under a hose. Cracks the valve open slightly. What comes out is milky and fizzing. Velez has a piercing feeling of terror. Coolant is supposed to be clear. Before he can think about what this means, Velez closes the valve, dumps the sample down the sink, and hurries out, closing the door behind him. Something's wrong, Ed. Whatever's coming out of the reactor looks like Alka-Seltzer. You sure those valves are the right ones? No question. I double-checked them, but I should check them again. Let me take the sample this time. Before Velez can argue, Hauser opens the door and steps back inside. Velez watches, his head throbbing with worry as his friend triple-checks the valve lineup. Hauser then grabs a sample and takes it over to the chemistry area. Velez paces out in the hallway. Then he spins on his feet and mutters a curse. He forgot to start his stopwatch, even though he can already tell it's been well over a minute. He knows that Hauser has a wife and 2 young kids. What is taking the chemist so long? Finally, Hauser bursts out of the chamber. Out of breath, he confirms the finding. The coolant's appearance is anything but normal, and he suspects that the froth is caused by chemicals that the system automatically injected. Velez frowns and squints, and he mulls over what this means. Slowly, it dawns on him. 3 Mile Island must be suffering from profound problems. Only that could explain so many automated safety responses. And that means something else, something even more worrying. The nuclear core must be far more damaged than anyone suspects, and this accident is very far from over. Later that evening, the sky is dark over Strinestown, Pennsylvania, just a few miles south of 3 Mile Island. Christine Lehman lies in bed watching the CBS News. The 21-year-old can hear her neighbors outside her window, a woman and her husband fighting. A couple of kids are playing street hockey. Lehman wishes she could be outside too, enjoying the night air, but she can barely move. Lehman woke up with stomach pains that felt like knives jabbing her. She was vomiting and had a fever. She'd been laid out in bed ever since. At first, she thought it must be some kind of flu, but as the day wore on, Lehman started to hear more about an accident at the power plant. She's heard that she isn't the only one who suddenly feels ill. As she lies in bed watching the news, Lehman thinks back on the last 24 hours. Yesterday, she felt fine. She'd even taken her 4-year-old daughter hiking at Rocky Ridge Park. From the park's northern end, there were vistas that spanned the river, and you could see the massive cooling towers of 3 Mile Island. Lehman remembers the steam rising from the towers. She doesn't know exactly how to describe it, but there was also a strange, metallic taste in the air. At the time, she didn't pay any mind. But now she's hearing the rumors about a release of deadly radiation from the plant. Her friends have told her that a doctor out of Pittsburgh is warning people to evacuate. But then there's the lieutenant governor who came on the news and said there was no danger, that everything was under control. Lehman doesn't know who to trust or what to do. Just then, Lehman hears a voice down the hall. It's her mother who's come to help out. She's trying to coax her granddaughter to eat dinner, but the little girl is saying she can't eat, that her stomach hurts. Lehman lays her head back on the pillow, exhausted. What if this isn't the flu? If there's radiation seeping out of that plant, she needs to get her young daughter out of town as quickly as possible. Because every minute they stay near 3 Mile Island is another minute they could be exposed. This whole thing is a mother's worst nightmare. Christine Lehman worries that the world isn't going to wake up from this crisis anytime soon. It's the morning of March 30th, 2 days after the initial accident at 3 Mile Island. Today, in the Pennsylvania governor's office, Lieutenant Governor Bill Scranton sits staring at a large map of Pennsylvania spread out on an antique table. Other maps lie scattered on the Persian rug near his feet. Scranton pauses and glances up across the room, where Governor Dick Thornburg is studying his own map. In his black-rimmed spectacles and Brooks Brothers suit, the 46-year-old governor radiates a commanding Ivy League presence. Still, Scranton knows that the two are partners as they respond to the crisis at 3 Mile Island. And as bad as it's gotten, this crisis is still a chance for Scranton to prove himself a formidable leader. Scranton turns back to the map and continues to assess evacuation plans. Last night, he had gone to bed believing that the accident at 3 Mile Island was essentially behind them. He had seen the nuclear plant with his own eyes. Everything seemed fine, under control. He'd woken up to find out that he was wrong. Earlier this morning, Scranton received a call from the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. There had just been another sizable venting of radioactive gases at 3 Mile Island. A helicopter hovering over the power plant had gotten a radioactivity reading of 1,200 millirems per hour. Anything over 2 millirems is considered unsafe for the public. Now, all the reassurances Scranton received feel like a fairy tale at best. 3 Mile Island has been tamed at all. And now he and the governor must decide whether they're going to evacuate local residents, and if they do, where those thousands of people will go. Scranton stands up and looks toward Thornburg. Sir, it's dawning on me. If we're going to evacuate, I think we should do it sooner rather than later. We need to take control and get ahead of this thing. Trust me, Bill, I hear you. But it's not exactly a simple decision, is it? We only know half the variables. Did anyone at MetEd say whether there are going to be more releases? Well, the real question is, can we trust a single person at that company? Scranton can see the look of worry on the governor's face. An evacuation will be chaotic and panicked as residents flee the area by car. Still, Scranton knows it's the best of two bad options. They can't afford to let residents wait around like sitting ducks as 3 Mile Island releases more and more radiation. Scranton points to the map and looks to the governor. Evacuating the residents isn't ideal, not by any means. But we could start by looking at a 5-mile evacuation radius, right around the plant. Build out from there if need be. That's what the NRC seems to want too. What would a 5-mile evacuation look like? That's a lot of people on the road at one time. Scranton pulls out a more detailed map of the area around 3 Mile Island. He spreads it across the table and squints. But a moment later, Scranton stops and looks up, his face pale with worry. Look at this. Residents from York County are supposed to drive eastbound on Interstate 76. That puts both counties on a path toward the Susquehanna River Bridge. Yeah, the same bridge, but both going opposite ways. Scranton looks up from the map and meets the governor's eyes. Up until now, an evacuation seemed like the best plan, a way to save people from a nuclear meltdown. But now Scranton feels his mouth go dry as he considers how an evacuation would actually play out. Look right here. If we evacuate, we'll have 2 groups of people driving as fast as they can and meeting at high speeds right here in the middle of a bridge. Thornburg stares at the map, then leans against his desk. He sighs deeply and looks at Scranton. There's going to be accidents. Worst case scenario, people get killed. Yeah, but at the same time, if this plant is out of control, we can't just sit by and watch. We need to take action, do something. Yes, Bill, you're right. What if we take it in stages? Start with a limited voluntary evacuation. Tell pregnant women and children to leave and other residents to remain inside. All right, we can do that. I can organize emergency trucks with loudspeakers. They'll drive through the towns and tell folks to stay inside. Yes, good, we'll do that. And I'll organize a press conference. We'll get the word out. Well, it seems like a plan. You ready? Thornburg nods, and with that, Scranton heads to the phone and dials emergency services. As he waits for an answer, he tries to imagine how the public will react. This might be fine. They might save lives by taking this cautious approach. On the other hand, if the public's anxiety is already high enough, even a small evacuation like this could cause a massive panic. It'd be like yelling fire in a crowded theater. A couple hours later, Christine Lehman stands on her mother's doorstep in Manchester, Pennsylvania. Just yesterday, Lehman was feeling sick to her stomach after hiking near 3 Mile Island. She was terrified that she'd been poisoned by radiation. But today, Lehman feels like she's recovered, and now she's driven to take action. She wants to leave town. She wants her mom to come with her. As they stand on the doorstep, her mother crosses her arms and refuses to leave. She believes that Lehman is overreacting, that they'll be fine if they stay home. But Lehman is convinced that nothing could be further from the truth. She has all the evidence she needs. She was just home when she heard a loudspeaker blaring from outside her house. She stepped outside and saw a fire truck racing past. The loudspeaker crackled again and issued a warning. Residents were supposed to stay inside until further notice and keep their doors and windows shut. Lehman then raced back in and turned on the radio. Soon she heard the voice of Governor Thornburg. He suggested that pregnant women and young children leave the area if possible. So Lehman didn't waste a moment. She grabbed her daughter and headed straight to her truck. It was then she saw her other neighbors packing their cars too, getting ready to leave. Her next-door neighbor was throwing guns and a chainsaw into the back of his pickup. He yelled over and told Lehman that no barrier or person was going to stop him from getting out. He wasn't waiting around for the government to save his life. Shortly after, Lehman was dropping her foot on the gas pedal and racing toward her mother's house. As she drove, she knew what she had to do. She had to pick up her mom and get her family miles away from the 3 Mile Island as fast as possible. Then they could come up with a plan. But now, as she stands on her mother's porch, Lehman is facing an unforeseen crisis. No matter what she says, her mother won't budge. Lehman points toward the distant cooling towers of 3 Mile Island, explaining that the power plant is releasing poison. Her mother looks unconvinced. She says that this all sounds like made-up drama. The plant looks the same to her as it always does. Lehman feels her blood boiling. She wants to scream, but she has to stop herself. It won't help. Instead, she tells her mother that you can't see radiation. You can't feel it either, but it can still kill you. Her mother remains defiant and says that this is her home. She won't abandon it. Lehman looks back at her truck. Her 4-year-old daughter sits in front, bundled up in a blanket. Lehman knows that she has to get her little girl to safety, but she can't leave behind her own mother. So she tries one more time. Lehman tells her mom that there's no knowing what will happen with the reactor. It's better to be safe than sorry. She waits as her mother stares into the distance. But then her mother gently shakes her head and says she'll be fine. She'll see them soon. Lehman stands, feeling frozen. She kisses her mother and then returns to the truck. As she drives away, she fights to hold onto the wheel. Her body shakes with equal parts frustration and grief. She wipes her eyes, then pulls out onto the main road. There she finds herself alongside a stream of other cars and trucks, all racing away from 3 Mile Island. Lehman glances at the power plant in the rearview mirror. She can't imagine what it's like for all the men and women working inside. She wonders what sort of radiation they're being exposed to. She swallows, her mouth dry, as she imagines a catastrophic meltdown at 3 Mile Island. But for now, all she can do is drive. She'll speed toward her aunt's house, 26 miles away. She prays it'll be far enough. Next, on American Scandal, government officials weigh the risks of a full-scale evacuation as fear spreads across southern Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, at 3 Mile Island, a massive hydrogen bubble inside the reactor raises the threat of an even greater catastrophe. From Wondery, this is episode 2 of 3 Mile Island for American Scandal. If you like our show, please give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. And be sure to tell your friends. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the Wondery app, or wherever you're listening right now. Join Wondery Plus and the Wondery app to listen ad-free. You'll also find some links and offers from our sponsors in the episode notes. Supporting them helps us keep offering our shows for free. Another way you can support the show is by filling out a small survey at Wondery.com/survey. Tell us what topics we might cover next. You can also find us and me on Twitter. Search for #American Scandal or follow me at Lindsay A. Graham. Be sure to listen to my other podcasts too, American History Tellers and American Elections Wiki Game. A quick note about our reenactments. In most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but all our dramatizations are based on historical research. Our consultant for this series is J. Samuel Walker. He is the author of the book 3 Mile Island, A Nuclear Crisis in Historical Perspective, which contains more rich details about the nuclear accident. And if you'd like to learn even more about 3 Mile Island, we recommend the book The Warning by Mike Gray and Ira Rosen. American Scandal is hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsay Graham, for Airship. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. This episode is written by Charles Olivier, edited by Christina Malzberger, produced by Gabe Ribbon. Executive producers are Stephanie Jens, Jenny Lauer-Beckman, and Hernan Lopez for Wondery.